In the middle of the 1500s in West Africa, a woman led an army of 20,000 soldiers. Her sword shined in the sun as she commanded men who would die for her without asking questions. She took control of lands bigger than entire countries today, built walls that are still standing 500 years later, and made kings across the desert afraid of her. But her name has almost been forgotten by history. This is the story of Queen Amina of Zaria, the warrior princess who should be as famous as Alexander the Great. What you are about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about African history. Wars in the Middle Ages, and the power of women in the ancient world. To understand Queen Amina's story, we need to go back to a time when Europe was still coming out of the Dark Ages, when the Ottoman Empire was at its strongest, and when West Africa had some of the richest and most advanced kingdoms on earth. The year is 1533. While Henry VIII ruled England and the Inca Empire fought Spanish invaders, in what is now northern Nigeria, the Hausa city-states were doing very well. These were not simple villages. They were busy city centers of trade, learning, and military power. 7 major city-states controlled the region: Kano, Katsina, Zazzau, Gobir, Rano, Daura, and Biram. Together, they controlled the southern end of the trade routes across the Sahara Desert that had made North Africa and the Middle East rich for hundreds of years. Zazzau, later known as Zaria, sat at an important crossroads. To the north were the salt mines of the Sahara. To the south were forests full of kola nuts, ivory, and enslaved people. Gold came from the west, and horses came from the Lake Chad area in the east. Whoever controlled Zazzau controlled incredible wealth. The city itself was amazing for its time. Huge walls made of red earth stretched for miles, with watchtowers where guards looked out for danger. Inside these walls, buildings made of mud bricks rose 2 and 3 stories high. Markets overflowed with goods from places as far away as Venice and Cairo. Scholars studied math, astronomy, and Islamic law in schools that were as good as those in Timbuktu. Blacksmiths made weapons that could cut through steel from Europe. This was not a backward place. This was a civilization at its peak. Into this world of power, secrets, and endless opportunity, a child was born to the royal family. Her name was Amina, daughter of King Nikatau, the 22nd ruler of Zazzau, and Queen Bakwa Turunku. The year was around 1533, though some historians think it was as early as 1530 or as late as 1536. Historical records from this time are incomplete. Put together from oral stories, Arabic writings, and the Kano Chronicle, the most complete historical document of the Hausa states. From the moment she was born, Amina was different. She was born into wealth, yes, but also into expectations. As a princess of Zazzau, she was not raised in hiding, but in preparation. The Hausa kingdoms, unlike many societies of that time, recognized that women could hold power, could own property, and could even rule. It was rare, but not impossible. Amina's father, King Nikatau, was a warrior king who had made Zazzau bigger through smart marriages and careful military campaigns. He understood that power in the region did not come from God-given right alone. It came from the strength of your army, the cleverness of your alliances, and your control of trade routes. These lessons would shape Amina's entire way of thinking. But Amina had a brother, Karama. In a society where men had more power, even one as relatively fair as Zazzau, the throne usually went to the male heir. Amina would have understood from a young age that her path to power would not be easy. Yet something special happened during Amina's childhood. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, proved to be more than just a king's wife. She was a political force on her own. When King Nikatau died in 1549, the throne did not immediately go to the young Karama. Instead, through political moves that showed her strong intelligence, Bakwa Turunku became a power behind the throne. And some sources say she may have ruled as regent. This is where Amina received her real education. While other noble girls learned household skills, Amina learned the art of war. But what happened next would set the stage for one of history's most amazing changes. Imagine being a teenage girl in a world where your future is supposed to be decided by marriage and having children. Now imagine making a choice that goes against every expectation, a choice that would seem impossible, even crazy, to those around you. Amina made that choice. At an age when most princesses were learning court manners and preparing for arranged marriages to neighboring rulers, Amina demanded military training. And amazingly, she got it. The Hausa military tradition was advanced and tough. Warriors trained from childhood in horseback riding, sword fighting, spear throwing, and archery. They learned tactics passed down through generations, how to read the land, how to coordinate cavalry charges, how to surround walled cities. The military culture of the region combined native African warrior traditions with influences from the Islamic world to the north and the cavalry tactics of the great empires of Sudan. Amina threw herself into this world with an intensity that shocked her teachers. She learned to ride before she could fully control a warhorse. She trained with weapons until her hands bled. She studied the campaigns of great generals, not just African leaders, but the tactics of the Byzantine Empire, the Mamluks of Egypt, and the Ottoman Turks, whose influence was spreading across North Africa. But here's what made Amina truly special. She did not just learn to fight, she learned to lead. Leadership in a warrior culture was not about being the strongest or fastest. It was about earning respect from men who had been raised to believe that women were beneath them. It was about tactical brilliance that saved lives and won victories. It was about a presence, an aura, that made tough warriors willing to follow you into certain death. Amina developed all of this. By her late teens, she was regularly joining Zazzau's military expeditions, not as a symbolic figure or a political token, but as an active participant. She rode with the cavalry. She fought in battles. She watched how battles were won and lost. She learned that war was not glorious. It was calculated, methodical, and unforgiving. During this time, Zazzau's military was in almost constant low-level fighting. The Hausa city-states were rivals as much as allies. They competed for control of trade routes, for tribute states, for respect. Small kingdoms to the south and west were always testing for weakness. Nomadic groups from the north raided for slaves and livestock. It was a world where military readiness was not optional. It was survival. Amina stood out in several small campaigns during the 1550s and early 1560s. The historical record is frustratingly thin on details, but oral traditions kept in Zaria speak of a princess who fought alongside men, who commanded a personal guard of elite warriors, and whose strategic insights impressed even the most experienced generals. But there was a problem, one that would test everything Amina had worked for. Her brother Karama took the throne around 1549. As the new Sarki, the title for the king of Zazzau, Karama was now the supreme military commander. Amina, despite her skills, answered him. In most societies, this would be the end of her military career. She would be married off to cement an alliance, sent to the women's quarters. Her warrior days nothing more than a strange footnote in the kingdom's history. But Karama made a decision that would change the course of West African history. He recognized his sister's genius. Instead of pushing Amina aside, Karama elevated her. He gave her command of cavalry units. He asked for her advice on military strategy. He sent her as his representative on campaigns. It was unprecedented. A woman holding military rank in a society where men held power. Some traditionalists in the court were shocked, but Karama understood something important. Amina was the best military mind in Zazzau, perhaps in all the Hausa states. To ignore her talents because of her gender would be strategically foolish. For the next 16 years, from about 1549 to 1565, Amina served as one of Zazzau's leading military commanders under her brother's reign. She led expeditions to defeat rebellious tribute states. She defended against attacks from rival kingdoms. She oversaw the strengthening of Zazzau's defenses. All the while, She was building something even more valuable than military victories. She was building loyalty. The warriors who served under Amina developed a fierce devotion to her. She shared their hardships on campaign. She made sure they were fed and paid. She mourned their dead and celebrated their victories. She proved herself in combat again and again. Slowly, the idea of a woman warrior became not just acceptable, but admired. But even as Amina's reputation grew, she faced a choice that every woman in her position has faced throughout history: marriage. Pressure mounted for Amina to marry. Marriage alliances were the currency of politics in the Middle Ages. A union with a neighboring royal house could bring peace, trade agreements, and military pacts. Amina's marriage could secure Zazzau's borders for a generation. Amina refused. According to tradition, she took a revolutionary stance. She would never marry permanently. Some sources say she took lovers, captured princes or warriors who caught her eye, but sent them away after a single night. Other accounts claim she remained celibate, married only to warfare and government. Whatever the truth, the message was clear. Amina would not be controlled through marriage. She would not be used as a pawn in someone else's political game. This decision was radical beyond modern understanding. In 16th century West Africa, as in most of the world, a woman's value was largely decided by her role as wife and mother. By rejecting marriage, Amina was rejecting the basic social contract of her time. She was declaring that she existed for herself, that her destiny was hers to command. It was a declaration that would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Because in 1565, after ruling for 16 years, King Karama died and everything changed. The death of a king in medieval Africa was never simple. It was a moment of maximum danger, a window when rivals struck, when ambitious nobles plotted, when neighboring kingdoms tested for weakness. In the power vacuum that followed Karama's death, Zazzau stood at a cliff's edge. The court had to choose a new Saki, and the choice they faced was unprecedented. There were male relatives who could claim the throne, cousins, nephews, distant branches of the royal family. Any of them would be a traditional choice. Safe, expected, unremarkable. But there was also Amina. By 1565, Amina was in her early 30s, in the prime of her life by medieval standards. She had commanded troops for 16 years. She had proven her strategic brilliance in countless campaigns. She had the loyalty of the military. She had the respect of the people. And perhaps most importantly, she had built relationships with the power brokers at court, the merchants whose trade she protected, the Islamic scholars whose authority made rulers legitimate, the noble families whose sons served under her command. The discussions were intense. Some court officials argued for tradition. A male ruler had always led Zazzau. Others pointed out that tradition also demanded skill, and no male candidate could match Amina's qualifications. The military predictably supported Amina strongly. They had seen her genius firsthand. They knew that under her leadership, Zazzau would be secure, but there was another concern, one whispered in corners and debated in hushed councils. What would the other Hausa states think? What would rival kingdoms do if they saw Zazzau led by a woman? Would it be seen as weakness? Would it invite attack? Amina's supporters made a strong argument. Let them come. Let them test Zazzau's defenses and see how quickly they regret it. In the end, Amina took the throne. The exact method is not clear from historical sources, whether it was unanimous, contested, or achieved through political maneuvering. But by 1565, Amina was Saki of Zazzau, Queen Amina. The warrior princess had become the warrior queen. The coronation ceremonies mixed Islamic and traditional Hausa elements. Islamic scholars recited prayers recognizing her power. Traditional priests performed rituals connecting her to the earth and ancestors of Zazzau. Warriors pledged their swords to her service. Merchants presented tribute acknowledging her protection of trade routes. The people of Zaria filled the streets cheering for their new queen. But Amina knew that ceremony meant nothing without power. And power in the world of the Hausa city-states came through military might. She did not waste time. Within months of her coronation, some sources say within weeks, Amina launched her first campaign as queen. Her target was strategic, a southern territory that had been resisting Zazzau's authority and threatening trade caravans heading to the forest regions. It was both a test of her rule and a message to anyone who might see a woman on the throne as an opportunity for rebellion. Amina personally led an army estimated at 20,000 warriors. This was an enormous force for that time, requiring sophisticated logistics, supply lines, and command structure. The army included cavalry, mounted on horses from the Lake Chad region, infantry armed with spears and swords, archers with powerful composite bows, and siege engineers capable of breaking through fortified settlements. The campaign was swift and decisive. Amina used tactics that would become her signature: rapid cavalry movements, psychological warfare, strategic surrounding, and an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and enemy movements. Within weeks, the rebellious territory was submitted. Its ruler swore allegiance to Zazzau. Trade routes were secured, but here's where Amina revealed her true innovation. After conquering the territory, she did something no previous Hausa ruler had done systematically. She ordered the construction of walls around the newly conquered settlement. Not just simple fences, but massive earthwork fortifications. Thick walls of compressed earth, designed to withstand siege weapons and cavalry charges. These walls served two purposes. They protected the settlement from outside attack, and they made sure that rebellion from within was almost impossible. This was the birth of Amina's most lasting legacy, the Amina Walls. Over the next few years, as her conquests expanded, Amina would fortify every major settlement under her control. These walls, many of which still stand in modern Nigeria 5 centuries later, became synonymous with her rule. They were defensive structures, yes, but they were also symbols of permanence, of Amina's intention to hold what she conquered, of Zazzau's transformation from one city-state among many to the dominant power in the region. But fortifications alone did not build an empire. Amina understood that lasting power required more than military might. It required economic dominance. She turned her attention to the trade routes. The trans-Saharan trade was the lifeblood of West African kingdoms. Gold, ivory, cola nuts, enslaved people and other goods flowed north across the Sahara to North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Salt, horses, textiles, weapons, and luxury goods flowed south. The kingdoms that controlled the routes grew wealthy beyond measure. The kingdoms that did not stagnate and died. Amina began a systematic campaign to extend Zazzau's control over these routes. She conquered key trading towns. She established military garrisons at critical junctions. She negotiated or forced agreements with merchant clans and caravans, making sure they paid tribute to Zazzau in exchange for protection from bandits and rival kingdoms. By the late 1560s, Zazzau, under Amina's rule, controlled trade routes stretching from the forest regions of the south to the Sahara in the north, and from the territory of the Nupe kingdom in the west toward Lake Chad in the east. The wealth flowing into Zaria was unprecedented. The city grew. New markets opened. Artisans and merchants from across West Africa flocked to the capital, drawn by security and opportunity. But with success came danger. Success breeds envy, and envy breeds enemies. The other Hausa city-states, Kano, Katsina, Gobir, watched Zazzau's rise with growing alarm. They saw their own trade revenues declining as merchants chose Amina's protected routes. They saw tribute states they once dominated now paying allegiance to Zaria. They saw a shift in the regional balance of power that threatened their own positions. And they began to plot. Diplomatic pressure came first. Messengers arrived in Zaria with gifts and smooth words, suggesting that perhaps Zazzau was expanding too quickly, that perhaps Queen Amina should focus on internal development rather than outside conquest, that perhaps it would be better for regional stability if the trade routes were shared more fairly. Amina's response was polite but firm. Zazzau would continue to expand as long as there were territories to conquer and trade routes to secure. Any kingdom that wished to challenge this policy was welcome to try. It was a challenge that several kingdoms would soon accept. But before that confrontation came, Amina made a decision that would reshape the political landscape of West Africa for generations. A decision so bold, so daring, that when word spread, rulers from Cairo to the Atlantic coast took notice. What happened next would prove whether Amina was merely a capable military leader or something far more extraordinary. It was around 1568, 3 years into Amina's reign. Zazzau was prosperous, well-defended and militarily dominant in its immediate region. Most rulers would consolidate at this point, enjoy the fruits of success, strengthen internal government, rest on their achievements. Amina was not a ruler. She stood in her war council chamber, surrounded by her most trusted generals. Maps made of leather and fabric spread across wooden tables, marked with stones and shells, indicating settlements, trade routes, and military forces. Her commanders, hardened veterans who had fought beside her for years, waited for her to speak. Amina's finger traced a route on the map, moving south and west, far beyond Zazzau's current borders. She was proposing something that seemed impossible, a campaign to conquer territories all the way to the Quararafa kingdom in the south and toward Nupe in the southwest. These were not minor border fights. This was empire building on a scale not seen in Hausaland for generations. Her generals were doubtful. The logistics alone were staggering. They were talking about multiple campaigns, thousands of miles of territory, battles against kingdoms with their own powerful armies. The resources required, food, weapons, horses, manpower, would strain even Zazzau's considerable wealth. But Amina had thought this through. She did not propose conquest for glory or personal ambition. She saw a strategic necessity. The kingdoms to the south and west controlled resources that Zazzau needed: forest products, agricultural lands, and crucially, access to different trade networks that connected to the Atlantic coast, where European traders were beginning to appear in significant numbers. Moreover, if Zazzau did not expand, its rivals would. The balance of power in West Africa was constantly shifting. Standing still was the same as decline. To secure Zazzau's future, Amina had to strike now, while she had momentum, resources, and a battle-hardened army. Her generals recognized the logic. They also recognized something else. Amina's strategic vision was generations ahead of its time. She was not thinking about next year or even the next decade. She was thinking about Zazzau's position in a changing world, where transatlantic trade might soon rival trans-Saharan routes, where European technology and weapons were entering Africa, where the old certainties were crumbling. The campaign began in 1569. Amina assembled the largest army Zazzau had ever fielded. Estimates from various sources suggest somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 warriors, an enormous force for pre-industrial Africa. This army included cavalry units that were among the best in West Africa, infantry armed with iron-tipped spears and swords, archers, and specialized units for siege warfare. The first targets were smaller kingdoms and settlements on Zazzau's southern border. These campaigns served as both military objectives and training exercises, allowing Amina to test her logistics, identify capable junior officers, and refine tactics for the larger conflicts to come. The pattern of conquest became predictable: rapid cavalry approach, psychological intimidation through displays of force, offers of peaceful submission with reasonable terms, and if refused, overwhelming military assault. Amina fought not to destroy completely, but to conquer. She wanted tribute states that would trade, pay taxes, and provide military support, not empty wastelands. Settlement after settlement fell. Some resisted and were crushed. Others submitted without a fight, calculating that Amina's terms were better than destruction. After each conquest, Amina's engineers, skilled builders who had perfected earthwork construction, began building walls. The Amina walls started to spread across the landscape like a connected network of fortified points, each one a statement of Zazzau's permanence. But as Amina pushed deeper into southern territories, she encountered more organized resistance. The Rafa, a powerful group of peoples to the southeast, had been watching Amina's expansion with growing alarm. They were not some minor kingdom to be easily conquered. They had their own sophisticated military traditions, their own network of alliances, and a fierce determination not to become Zazzau's subjects. The first major battle between Amina's forces and the Rafa occurred near a river crossing that both sides recognized as strategically crucial. Control of this crossing meant control of trade routes connecting the forest regions to the Sahel. Amina arrived with her main army to find Rafa forces already dug in on the far bank. It was a strong defensive position. Trying to cross the river under fire would result in terrible casualties. A conventional commander might lay siege, waiting for the enemy to run out of supplies, or might seek an alternative crossing, potentially adding weeks to the campaign. Amina did neither. Under cover of darkness, she sent cavalry units upstream and downstream, searching for alternative crossings. But this was a trick. Her real plan was far more daring. She ordered her engineers to build rafts and floating platforms. Not enough to transport her entire army, but enough for a shock force of elite warriors. As dawn broke, Amina launched a coordinated assault. While her main army made noise at the primary crossing point, drawing Rafa attention and forces, her elite units crossed at two different points at the same time using the rafts. The Rafa found themselves attacked from three directions at once. Their defensive position collapsed. Within hours, the battle was over, with Rafa forces in full retreat. It was a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Amina had shown that she could outsmart as well as outfight her enemies. Word of the battle spread rapidly. Other kingdoms in the region faced a choice: submit to Zazzau or risk facing Amina's army in battle. Most chose submission. Over the next several years, from about 1569 to 1573, Amina conducted campaign after campaign, each one extending Zazzau's reach further from the capital. Her army became a well-oiled military machine. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles, maintained by a complex system of garrison towns and tribute states required to provide resources. Her cavalry became legendary, fast, disciplined, capable of covering enormous distances and striking with devastating effect. But Amina's genius was not just military. She understood that conquest meant nothing without administration. As territories fell under her control, she put in place a system of government that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Local rulers who submitted peacefully were generally allowed to continue governing their own people, provided they paid tribute to Zazzau, contributed warriors to Amina's army when required, and protected trade routes through their territories. This system of indirect rule allowed Amina to control vast territories without keeping large occupation forces everywhere. For territories that resisted and were conquered by force, Amina installed governors from Zaria, usually successful military commanders or trusted administrators. These governors were given significant freedom, but were ultimately accountable to the Queen. They were expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and make sure that Zazzau's interests were protected. The revenue flowing into Zaria became enormous. Gold, ivory, cola nuts, textiles, livestock, and enslaved people captured in wars all contributed to the royal treasury. Amina used this wealth not just for personal luxury, although she certainly enjoyed the trappings of power, but to fund further military campaigns, to improve Zaria's infrastructure, and to support the Islamic scholars and traditional priests whose blessing made her rule legitimate. By 1574, Zazzau, under Amina's rule, had become the dominant power in Hausaland. Her territory extended from the edges of the Sahara to the forest regions of the south, and from Nupe lands in the west to territories approaching Lake Chad in the east. She had not quite created an empire on the scale of Mali or Songhai, but she had built something unprecedented for a Hausa ruler, a unified, militarily powerful state that could project force across hundreds of miles. But success, as Amina was about to discover, created its own problems. The other Hausa city-states could no longer ignore Zazzau's dominance. Kano and Katsina, the two most powerful traditional rivals to Zazzau, began coordinating their policies. They reached out to kingdoms that Amina had not yet conquered, offering alliances and military support. They spread propaganda suggesting that Amina's rule was illegitimate, that a woman leading warriors was contrary to Islamic law, that Zazzau had grown arrogant and had to be brought down. Trade wars erupted. Merchants from Kano and Katsina refused to use Amina's routes. They established alternative paths, even though these were longer and more dangerous. They spread rumors of Amina's cruelty, her ambition, her dangerous innovations. Diplomatic isolation followed. When Amina sent messengers to other courts, they were received coldly or not at all. Marriage alliances that might have secured peace were refused. Religious leaders in rival kingdoms issued fatwas questioning Amina's legitimacy. And then, in late 1574 or early 1575, Amina received intelligence that confirmed her worst fears. Kano, Katsina, and several smaller house estates were forming a military coalition. Their clear goal, to invade Zazzau, remove Amina from power, and divide her territories among themselves. It was the crisis Amina had been preparing for since taking the throne. Everything she had built, the walls, the tribute states, the army, the trade network, was about to be tested in the most basic way possible. War was coming. Not a border fight or a minor conflict, but an existential battle that would determine Zazzau's future. Amina returned to Zaria and immediately called together her war council. The discussion was serious. Her intelligence reports suggested the coalition might field an army of 40,000 to 50,000 warriors, roughly twice the size of Amina's available forces. They would be invading from multiple directions, trying to divide Amina's army and overwhelm Zazzau's defenses. Her generals proposed various strategies: defensive warfare, allowing the enemy to exhaust themselves against Zazzau's walls; diplomatic outreach, trying to peel off members of the coalition with offers of favorable terms; even a radical suggestion to abandon the outer territories and consolidate around Zaria itself. Amina rejected all of these. Instead, she proposed something that shocked even her most experienced commanders, something so bold, so risky, that it could either save Zazzau or destroy it completely. But what was this plan? And could even Amina's genius overcome such overwhelming odds? The answer would determine not just the fate of Zazzau, but the future of an entire region. The situation was desperate. Spring of 1575. Intelligence reports flooded into Zaria daily, each one more alarming than the last. The coalition forces were gathering at multiple points along Zazzau's borders. Kano was mobilizing its famous cavalry units. Katsina was bringing siege equipment capable of breaking through even Amina's walls. Smaller states were contributing thousands of warriors eager for a share of the spoils when Zazzau fell. Amina's court was divided. Some advisors counseled submission. Perhaps Amina could negotiate terms, agree to reduce Zazzau's territory, pay tribute to the coalition, even agree to step down from the throne in favor of a male relative. At least this way, Zazzau itself would survive, but Amina knew better. The coalition did not want compromise. They wanted Zazzau's complete destruction as a regional power. They wanted its trade routes, its tribute states, its wealth. And they wanted to make an example of the warrior queen who dared to challenge the male-dominated order of Hausa politics. Submission was not an option. The only question was how to fight. This is where Amina revealed the plan she had been forming, and it was daring beyond belief. Instead of waiting for the coalition to invade, she would strike first. Not at the coalition's assembled armies. That would be suicide. Instead, she would attack the coalition's weak point, its supply lines and tribute states. The logic was ruthless but brilliant. The coalition army was huge, yes, but huge armies require enormous resources: food, water, fodder for horses, weapons, medical supplies. All of this had to flow continuously from the coalition's home territories to their forward positions. Disrupt those supply lines, and the army becomes a problem rather than an asset. Moreover, the coalition states had their own tributary kingdoms and vassal states providing resources and warriors. If Amina could flip some of these through bribery, threats, or military action, the coalition's numerical advantage would disappear. Her generals were stunned. What Amina was proposing was not a battle plan. It was an entire campaign strategy that attacked the enemy's political and economic infrastructure, rather than its military directly. It was generations ahead of conventional military thinking. But it required speed, coordination, and a willingness to take enormous risks. Amina divided her army into multiple fast-moving columns. The bulk of her forces remained around Zaria, creating the appearance that she was preparing for defensive warfare. But elite units, cavalry mostly, capable of covering huge distances quickly, deployed secretly to multiple locations around Zazzau's borders. In late spring 1575, Amina launched her counter-offensive. A cavalry force of 3,000 warriors appeared suddenly in Kano's tributary territories to the north, far from where the coalition expected any resistance. They did not attack Kano itself. The walls were too strong and the garrison too large. Instead, they systematically raided villages and towns that supplied Kano with food and resources. Granaries burned. Livestock was driven off. Trade caravans were ambushed. Within weeks, Kano was facing a supply crisis. At the same time, another Zazzau force attacked Katsina's southern territories, disrupting their supply lines and forcing Katsina to send troops away from the planned invasion to defend their own lands. But Amina's masterstroke was her diplomatic offensive. Her messengers fanned out across the region, carrying a simple message to smaller states that had allied with the coalition. Zazzau remembers its friends and punishes its enemies. States that withdrew from the coalition now would face no punishment. States that remained would be Amina's first targets once this war was over. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. The smaller states had not joined the coalition out of hostility to Zazzau. They joined out of fear of Kano and Katsina or hope of gaining some advantage. Now Amina was offering them an exit. Several states began wavering. A few quietly sent messages to Zaria pledging neutrality. The coalition leadership faced a dilemma. Their carefully planned invasion was falling apart before it even began. Their supply lines were under attack. Their alliance was breaking up. They needed a decisive victory to restore momentum and unity. In midsummer 1575, the coalition finally launched its invasion. A massive army, estimates suggest around 40,000 warriors after some allies withdrew, advanced on Zaria from the north and west at the same time. The coalition commanders were confident. Even with Amina's disruptions, they still outnumbered Zazzau's defending forces. They had siege equipment. They had experienced generals. They had righteous anger at Zazzau's arrogance. Amina let them come. The coalition army found Zazzau's outer territories largely empty. Villages were abandoned, granaries destroyed or emptied, wells poisoned. Amina had put in place a scorched earth policy. Anything that could supply the invading army had been removed or destroyed. The coalition had to carry all its supplies with it, stretching their already stressed logistics even further. When the coalition forces finally reached the first major fortified settlement, one of Amina's wall-protected towns, about 3 days' march from Zaria itself, they prepared for a lengthy siege. The walls were formidable, and intelligence suggested a significant garrison inside. The siege began. Coalition forces surrounded the settlement, brought up siege equipment, and prepared for a long assault. Days passed, then weeks. The garrison refused to surrender. Coalition forces launched assault after assault. Each one pushed back with heavy casualties, and then the garrison disappeared. Under cover of darkness, using underground tunnels Amina's engineers had built for exactly this purpose, the defenders evacuated the settlement completely. When coalition forces finally broke through the walls and stormed inside, they found an empty town. No supplies, no defenders, nothing of value. They had spent weeks and thousands of casualties, capturing literally nothing. It was humiliating and demoralizing. Worse, it revealed Amina's strategy. She never intended to defend the outer territories in conventional sieges. She intended to bleed the coalition through a war of attrition, forcing them to spend resources attacking empty fortifications, while her cavalry harassed their supply lines. The coalition leadership faced a terrible choice. Press on towards Zaria itself, knowing that supply shortages were becoming critical, or withdraw and face political disaster at home. They chose to press on. It was exactly what Amina wanted. By the time coalition forces reached Zaria itself in late summer, they were exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. They had been marching and fighting for months. Casualties from Amina's raids and the sieges of empty fortifications had been significant. Disease was spreading through their camps due to poor sanitation and limited food. The coalition that started with 40,000 warriors now had perhaps 30,000 combat-effective troops, and they were facing Zaria's walls, the most formidable fortifications in Hausaland. Amina had spent weeks preparing. Her full army, about 20,000 warriors, was concentrated in and around the capital. Fresh troops, well-fed, fighting on familiar ground with their backs to their homes and families. The walls had been reinforced. Every approach had been fortified. Supplies to withstand a siege of many months had been stockpiled, but Amina did not plan to wait for a siege. The coalition established camps around Zaria, preparing for a long assault. Their commanders knew they could not simply storm the walls. That would result in terrible casualties. They needed to methodically reduce the defenses, bring up siege equipment, and starve out the defenders. On the third night of the siege, Amina struck. She launched a night raid in force. 10,000 warriors pouring out of Zaria's gates in a coordinated assault on the coalition's camps. The attack came from multiple directions at the same time, exploiting gaps in the coalition's perimeter that Amina's scouts had identified. The coalition forces, exhausted and not expecting aggression from defenders, were thrown into chaos. The battle that followed was brutal and confusing. In darkness, fighting broke down into dozens of small fights. Coalition commanders struggled to organize a coherent defense. Some units fought effectively, others panicked and fled. The carefully planned siege dissolved into a melee that favored Zazzau's fresh, well-led warriors. By dawn, the coalition's camps were in ruins. Thousands of coalition warriors were dead or captured. Crucial siege equipment had been destroyed. Most importantly, the coalition's remaining supply wagons, containing desperately needed food and weapons, had been captured or burned. The coalition army was broken. What followed was less a battle than a rout. Coalition forces began withdrawing in disorder. Some units maintained discipline and conducted fighting retreats. Others simply fled, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades. Amina's cavalry pursued relentlessly, turning withdrawal into catastrophe. By the time surviving coalition forces struggled back to their home territories, they had lost more than half their original strength. Kano had suffered thousands of casualties. Gatsina's famous cavalry units were shattered. Smaller states that contributed warriors faced the political consequences of a disastrous military adventure. The coalition war was over. Zazzau had won a victory so complete, so overwhelming, that it would be remembered for generations. But Amina did not stop there. In the aftermath of victory, while her enemies were reeling and disorganized, she launched a series of punishment campaigns. Territories that supported the coalition faced Zazzau's punishment. Some were conquered outright and absorbed into Amina's growing domain. Others were forced to pay massive penalties and provide hostages as guarantees of future loyalty. Kano and Katsina, the coalition's leaders, were forced to negotiate peace treaties that were humiliating in their terms. They had to recognize Zazzau's dominance. They had to open their markets to Zazzau's merchants on favorable terms. They had to pay tribute, not as formal vassals, but as gifts that everyone understood were actually protection payments. The balance of power in Hausaland had fundamentally shifted. Before the coalition war, Zazzau was powerful, but still one state among several. After the war, Zazzau was unmistakably dominant. Amina's authority extended across territories that dwarfed those of any previous Hausa ruler. But here's what made Amina truly remarkable as a ruler. She did not simply crush her defeated enemies. She understood that stable power required not just military dominance, but political legitimacy and economic prosperity. In the years immediately following the coalition war, roughly 1576 to 1578, Amina put in place a series of policies designed to transform her military conquests into lasting political authority. First, she invested heavily in infrastructure. Trade routes across her territories were improved and protected. Merchant caravans traveling through Zazzau's lands enjoyed security unprecedented in the region. This attracted more trade, which brought more wealth, which funded more military and infrastructure development in a positive cycle. Second, she established a more systematic administrative structure. Previously, Zazzau's territorial control was somewhat random. Conquered territories paid tribute but otherwise governed themselves. Now Amina created a more formalized system. Governors received clear instructions on tax collection, justice administration, and military duties. Regular inspections ensured compliance. It was the beginning of what might have evolved into a true bureaucratic state, rather than just a collection of tribute territories. Third, she cultivated relationships with Islamic scholars and institutions. Amina was a practicing Muslim, and she understood that religious legitimacy was crucial for maintaining authority. She funded the construction of mosques. She supported Islamic education. She presented herself not as a revolutionary overturning tradition, but as a pious Muslim ruler who happened to be female, a distinction that made her rule more acceptable to traditionalists. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, she secured trade relationships beyond Hausaland. Zazzau under Amina began trading directly with North African kingdoms and city-states. Caravans from Zaria traveled to Tripoli, Cairo, and other Mediterranean ports. Trade goods from Zazzau appeared in markets from Morocco to Egypt. This was not just economically beneficial, it was politically crucial. By integrating Zazzau into trans-Saharan trade networks at the highest level, Amina made her kingdom indispensable. Other states could not afford to isolate or destroy Zazzau without disrupting trade routes that benefited everyone. By 1578, Zazzau under Amina's rule was at its peak. The kingdom controlled territories estimated at over 30,000 square miles, a substantial empire by West African standards. The population under Amina's authority might number in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps approaching 500,000. Zaria itself had grown into a major city, its markets overflowing with goods from across Africa and the Mediterranean world. Amina's personal wealth was legendary. She owned vast estates, herds of horses and cattle, and slaves by the thousands. She dressed in the finest imported silks and wore jewelry of gold and precious stones. Her court rivaled those of the great Islamic empires in sophistication and luxury. But Amina had not gone soft. She maintained her military readiness. Her army remained one of the most formidable in West Africa. She continued to lead campaigns personally, refusing to become a distant figurehead. In her mid-40s by this point, Amina was still riding at the head of her cavalry, still making tactical decisions on battlefields, still commanding the absolute loyalty of her warriors. The Amina walls continued to spread. Wherever Zazzau's authority extended, fortifications appeared. These walls served military purposes, certainly, but they were also symbols, visible reminders that Zazzau's power was permanent, built into the landscape itself. 500 years later, archaeologists and historians would study these walls, marveling at their extent and sophistication. But as the 1570s gave way to the 1580s, Amina faced new challenges. Not military threats, she had thoroughly dominated her immediate neighbors. Instead, she faced the challenges of success, how to maintain an empire built on military conquest, how to ensure succession when she had no children, how to adapt to a changing world where European influence in West Africa was slowly but surely growing. And there was something else, something that Amina perhaps did not fully recognize yet. She was getting older. The years of constant campaigning, the stress of ruling, the physical toll of warfare, all of it was accumulating. She was still formidable, still brilliant. But she was no longer the young warrior princess who first seized power. The question hanging over Zazzau in the early 1580s was one that Amina herself must have been thinking about. What happens when she is gone? She had no children. She had refused to marry. She had built an empire, but empires built around a single charismatic leader often collapse when that leader dies. Zazzau's stability depended entirely on Amina's personal authority. Remove her and what was left? Amina began making preparations for succession. She elevated certain military commanders and administrators, clearly grooming them for leadership. She strengthened the institutional structures of government, trying to make sure that Zazzau could function even without her direct oversight. She cultivated loyalty not just to herself personally, but to Zazzau as a concept, as a political entity that went beyond any individual ruler. But she also knew that ultimately, succession planning only went so far. When she died, there would be a power struggle. It was inevitable. The only question was whether Zazzau's institutions and the loyalty she had built would be strong enough to survive that struggle intact. In the meantime, Amina continued to rule with the same energy and brilliance that had characterized her entire reign. She led military expeditions into the mid-1580s. She personally oversaw major construction projects. She settled disputes brought before her court. She was not a ruler who delegated and disappeared into palace luxury. She was hands-on, engaged, constantly visible to her people, and she continued to build her legend. Stories about Amina spread far beyond Hausaland. Trans-Saharan merchants carried tales of the warrior queen to North Africa and beyond. Islamic scholars wrote about her in their chronicles, sometimes praising her piety and justice, sometimes questioning whether a woman could legitimately rule. European traders, beginning to establish themselves on the West African coast, heard rumors of a powerful inland kingdom, ruled by a woman warrior. But what these distant observers did not fully understand was that Amina was not just a military conqueror or a political leader. She had transformed an entire region. The security she established allowed trade to flourish in ways it never could when the Hausa states were constantly fighting among themselves. The infrastructure she built, walls, roads, market towns, would outlast her by centuries. The administrative system she developed would influence how future West African states were organized. Amina had created something that went beyond her own remarkable life. She had proven that women could rule, could conquer, could build empires as effectively as any man. In a world that systematically denied women access to power, Amina had kicked open a door and demonstrated what was possible. But history, as Amina knew better than most, is cruel and unpredictable. Even the greatest rulers eventually face their final challenge. And for Amina, that challenge was approaching faster than anyone realized. The year was 1586. Amina had ruled Zazzau for 21 years, an extraordinarily long reign by any standard, but especially for a medieval African monarch whose authority rested primarily on military power. She was in her mid-50s, an advanced age for someone who had spent decades campaigning in harsh climates, fighting in battles, and enduring the constant stress of ruling. But Amina showed no signs of slowing down. Intelligence reached Zaria of a new threat forming in the west. The Nupi Kingdom, a powerful state that had remained largely independent of Amina's authority, was expanding its own influence, potentially threatening trade routes that Zazzau depended on. The Nupi had been growing wealthy from trade with European merchants on the coast, acquiring new weapons, including some early firearms, and building a military force that could potentially challenge Zazzau's dominance. Amina's advisors urged caution. The Nupe were not some minor kingdom to be easily conquered. They were a sophisticated state with their own military traditions and considerable resources. Moreover, a campaign into Nupe territory would require marching through difficult terrain, crossing rivers and fighting far from Zazzau's bases of support. And there was the unspoken concern: was Amina still capable of leading such a campaign? She had been fortunate to avoid serious injury in decades of warfare, but age eventually defeats every warrior. Perhaps this was a campaign that should be led by younger generals, while Amina directed strategy from Zaria. Amina's response was characteristically direct. She would lead the campaign personally, as she always had. To do otherwise would signal weakness, would invite challenges from rivals who might see an aging queen as vulnerable. More importantly, it would betray everything she had built her reign on: personal leadership, courage, visibility. In late 1586 or early 1587, Amina led an army westward toward Nupe territory. It was a substantial force, perhaps 15,000 warriors, but not the massive armies she commanded in earlier campaigns. Zazzau's military was stretched, maintaining control over its vast territories. She could not strip garrisons from other regions without risking rebellion or invasion. The campaign began well enough. Smaller states between Zazzau and Nupe quickly submitted, either through diplomatic pressure or limited military action. Amina's reputation preceded her. Most rulers would rather pledge allegiance and pay tribute than face her army in battle. But as Amina's forces penetrated deeper into the region, they encountered more determined resistance. The Nupe had been preparing. They had formed alliances with smaller kingdoms in the region. They had positioned defensive forces at key river crossings and mountain passes. They were not going to submit without a fight. The first major engagement occurred at a river crossing defended by Nupe forces. It was eerily similar to Amina's early victory against the Quararafa decades earlier, a defensive position that had to be overcome to continue the advance. Amina employed similar tactics: feints, multiple crossing points, coordination between different parts of her army. But this time the Nupe was ready. They had studied Amina's tactics from previous campaigns. They anticipated the feints and had reserves positioned to respond to multiple crossing attempts. The battle was fierce and costly. Zazzau forces eventually secured the crossing, but casualties were higher than in any engagement Amina had fought in years. Worse, the Nupe forces conducted an organized retreat rather than routing. They would be able to regroup and fight again. It was a warning sign that this campaign would be different from Amina's previous conquests. Over the following months, Amina's army advanced slowly through Nupe territory. Each river, each fortified town, each mountain pass was contested. The Nupe were fighting a smart defensive war, avoiding large-scale battles they might lose while inflicting steady casualties through ambushes, raids, and defensive strong positions. Amina's supply lines were stretched thin. The scorched earth tactics that worked so well against the coalition invasion now worked against her. The Nupe had destroyed crops and driven off livestock, forcing Amina's army to carry all its supplies. Disease began to spread through her camps. Morale, while still strong due to Amina's personal presence and legendary reputation, was not what it once was. And then, in mid-1587, disaster nearly struck. Amina was personally leading a reconnaissance with a cavalry unit when they were ambushed by a much larger Nupe force. It was a well-planned trap. The Nupe had been tracking Amina's movements and set up an ambush specifically targeting her. The fighting was desperate and close quarters. Amina's cavalry was outnumbered 3-1. For the first time in decades, Amina was in genuine danger of being killed or captured. Her personal guards formed a protective ring around her, fighting with desperate fury to keep the Nupe warriors at bay. For several terrifying minutes, the fate of Zazzau hung in the balance. If Amina fell here, in an ambush in enemy territory far from help, her empire could collapse into civil war within weeks. The commanders waiting for news back at the main camp included several who would immediately declare themselves her successor. The unity she had built over 2 decades could shatter, but Amina survived. Her guards, fighting with the desperation of men who knew their own fates, depended on their queen's survival, managed to cut a path through the Nupe forces. Reinforcements from the main cavalry unit arrived. The Nupe, having failed to capture or kill Amina, withdrew before they were overwhelmed by Zazzau's superior numbers. Amina returned to camp with several wounds, none life-threatening but serious enough that she needed days to recover. It was a sobering moment. For the first time, Amina and her commanders had to face the reality that she was not invincible. That age and the accumulated toll of decades of warfare had made her vulnerable in ways she never was as a younger woman. The campaign against the Nupe continued, but its character changed. Amina's commanders insisted, and she reluctantly agreed, that she no longer personally lead reconnaissance missions or place herself in the most dangerous combat situations. It was a compromise that pained her deeply. She had built her authority on personal courage and visibility. To pull back, even slightly, felt like the beginning of the end. But she was practical enough to recognize necessity. Over the remainder of 1587 and into 1588, Amina's forces gradually wore down Nupe resistance. It was not the swift, decisive campaigns of her youth, but rather a grinding war of wearing down. Town by town, river crossing by river crossing, Zazzau advanced. The Nupe fought bravely, but ultimately they lacked the resources and manpower to match Zazzau's military machine. By late 1588, the Nupe leadership sued for peace. The terms were favorable to Zazzau: trade agreements, tribute payments, acknowledgement of Amina's authority. But it was not unconditional surrender. The Nupe retained their kingdom and much of their autonomy. It was a compromise that reflected the reality of the campaign. Amina had won, but at a higher cost than she was used to paying. The army returned to Zaria in early 1589. They received a hero's welcome, as always. Amina rode at the head of the procession, looking every inch the conquering queen. But those who knew her well noticed changes. She moved more stiffly. She looked tired in ways she never did before. The wounds from the ambush had healed, but they had left their mark. Amina was approaching 60 years old, an extraordinary age for a medieval warrior. She had ruled for nearly a quarter century. She had conducted more campaigns than most military leaders attempt in a lifetime. She had built an empire that dominated an entire region. And now, finally, she began to acknowledge what everyone around her had known for years. She would not live forever. Zazzau needed to prepare for her eventual death. The final years of Amina's reign, from 1589 to her death, were characterized less by military campaigns and more by efforts to secure her legacy. She continued to govern actively, but her focus shifted to institutional development, succession planning, and making sure that Zazzau could survive without her. She elevated several commanders to positions of great authority, clearly positioning them as potential successors. She strengthened alliances with neighboring states through diplomacy rather than conquest. She invested in projects that would outlast her: mosques, markets, fortifications, roads. There was a sense in these final years of Amina trying to transform her personal authority into institutional power. She knew that charismatic leadership dies with the leader. She was trying to create structures, traditions, and loyalties that would endure, but she also knew that ultimately, succession would be decided by power, military force, political alliances, the loyalty of key factions. All she could do was try to create conditions where the transition might be relatively peaceful and Zazzau's core territories would remain intact. In her final campaigns, smaller expeditions to put down rebellions or intimidate restive tribute states, Amina no longer led from the front lines. She directed strategy from the capital or from well-protected positions near the fighting. It was a necessary compromise, but one that eroded her mystique slightly. The warrior queen was becoming simply the queen, Contemporary accounts from this period, fragmentary as they are, describe Amina as still formidable but clearly aging. She moved with the aid of attendants. She suffered from ailments common to people who had spent decades campaigning in harsh climates, probably chronic pain from old injuries, possibly respiratory issues from years of exposure to smoke and dust, but her mind remained sharp. Visitors to her court described a ruler who was still very much in command, who discussed military strategy with clarity, who remembered details of events decades past, who could still intimidate subordinates with a glance and inspire loyalty with her presence. The exact date of Amina's death is lost to history. Different sources give different years, ranging from 1610 to as late as 1617. Most modern historians place it around 1610, which would make Amina about 77 years old. An extraordinary lifespan for that era. The most persistent tradition about her death places it during yet another military campaign. According to this account, Amina insisted on personally leading one final expedition, despite her advanced age and failing health. She died not in palace luxury, but in a military camp, still trying to expand or defend her kingdom, still refusing to accept that age had finally defeated her where no enemy could. If true, it is an ending that would have pleased her, a warrior's death on campaign, serving Zazzau to her final breath, but what happened after her death would prove whether everything she built could survive without her. If you have made it this far into the story of Queen Amina, you are clearly someone who appreciates history the way it should be. Immersive, detailed, and absolutely gripping. This channel is dedicated to bringing you more incredible stories like this one, diving deep into the lives of historical figures who deserve to be as famous as any European monarch or ancient conqueror. So if you have not already, hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who believe history should never be boring. There is so much more to explore together. Now, let's return to Zaria, to the aftermath of Amina's death, and to the question that will determine her true legacy, the death of a monarch who has ruled for decades, who has built an empire through personal charisma and military genius, who has no clear heir. This is a recipe for disaster. When news of Amina's death reached Zaria, the city went into mourning. But beneath the public grief, ruthless political calculation began. Multiple factions, each with their own candidate for the throne, started positioning for power. The military commanders who served under Amina were the most obvious contenders. They had troops loyal to them personally. They had experience governing territories. They had the respect of the warrior class. But they were also rivals who had spent years competing for Amina's favor. Now that she was gone, old jealousies and ambitions resurfaced. There were also members of the royal family, distant relatives of Amina, who had legitimate blood claims to the throne, even if they lacked her military genius or political skill. Some nobles supported these candidates, seeing them as more traditional, more manageable than the ambitious generals. And then there were external threats. Neighboring kingdoms that submitted to Amina's authority but never truly accepted it saw her death as an opportunity. If Zazzau descended into civil war, they might be able to reclaim independence or even expand at Zazzau's expense. The weeks following Amina's death were tense. Different factions jockeyed for position. Military units were moved to strategic locations. Alliances were formed and broken. Violence seemed inevitable. But then something remarkable happened, something that speaks to Amina's true legacy. The commanders and nobles of Zazzau, after intense negotiations, reached a compromise. They selected a new ruler, not one of the most powerful military commanders, which would have created intense resentment among the others, and not a weak royal figurehead, which would have left Zazzau vulnerable. Instead, they chose someone competent, relatively neutral, and acceptable to most factions. The new Saki faced immediate challenges. Several tribute states, sensing weakness, declared independence. Neighboring kingdoms tested Zazzau's defenses with border raids. Internal rivals plotted to overthrow the new ruler and claim power for themselves. But, and this is crucial, Zazzau did not collapse. The institutions Amina built, the administrative structures she established, the network of fortifications and garrisons she created, the trade relationships she cultivated, all of these survived her death. They provided continuity and stability even as political leadership changed. The Amina walls in particular proved their worth. When tribute states rebelled, they found themselves facing fortifications that made reconquest extremely difficult. When neighboring kingdoms invaded, they encountered a defensive network that Amina designed specifically to protect Zazzau's core territories. The walls bought time for Zazzau's army to mobilize and respond to threats. Moreover, the military culture Amina created persisted. The warriors who served under her did not suddenly forget their training or lose their discipline. The cavalry tactics she developed continued to be employed. The emphasis on fortification, on controlling trade routes, on systematic administration, all of these became standard practice for Zazzau's rulers. Over the next several years following Amina's death, Zazzau experienced what historians would recognize as a managed decline. The empire Amina built proved too large to maintain without her personal authority. Distant territories broke away. The extent of Zazzau's direct control shrank back closer to its historical core around Zaria itself. But, and this is the key point, Zazzau itself survived as a major power. It did not collapse into civil war. It did not get conquered by rivals. It continued to be one of the major Hausa city-states, continuing to play an important role in West African politics and trade for centuries. This is Amina's true achievement. She did not just conquer territories. She built institutions and systems that outlasted her. She did not just win battles. She created a military culture and defensive infrastructure that protected Zazzau even after her death. She did not just accumulate power. She legitimized women's authority in ways that influenced how future generations thought about leadership and capability. The historical record of the decades immediately after Amina's death is frustratingly sparse. We know that Zazzau continued to be ruled by a series of leaders, some more capable than others. We know that the kingdom maintained its independence and importance. We know that trade continued to flow through Zaria, that the walls continued to protect its territories, that the military traditions Amina established continued to be honored. But we have lost the details, the names of specific rulers, the exact boundaries of territories, the particular military campaigns. History, particularly African history from this period, is full of these gaps where oral traditions fade and written records are incomplete or lost. What we do know with certainty is this: the Amina walls, many of which still stand today over 400 years later, remain as physical testimony to her reign. Archaeologists have mapped extensive networks of these fortifications across northern Nigeria. The walls are sophisticated earthwork constructions, some with bases 20 feet thick and heights of over 20 feet. They represent hundreds of thousands of hours of labor, coordinated engineering on a massive scale, and a vision of territorial defense that was generations ahead of its time. Modern visitors to Zaria can still see portions of these walls. They have eroded over centuries, have been built over in some places, and have been destroyed by urban development. But they persist, stubborn monuments to a queen whose name was nearly forgotten, but whose physical achievements literally reshaped the landscape. And there is another legacy, one harder to measure but perhaps even more important. Amina proved what women could achieve in a world designed to limit them. In the centuries after her death, her story was preserved in oral traditions, in songs sung by griots, in tales told to children. These stories varied in details. Some portrayed her as almost superhuman, others focused on her romantic exploits, still others emphasized her piety and justice. But all agreed on the core fact: a woman ruled Zazzau, built an empire, commanded armies, and earned a place among the greatest leaders in Hausa history. This mattered. It provided a counter-narrative to the male-dominated assumptions that ruled most societies. It demonstrated that women's exclusion from power was a choice, not a necessity. It inspired and continues to inspire girls and women who hear her story to imagine possibilities beyond the role society assigns them. In 1975, over 350 years after Amina's death, the Nigerian government issued a series of stamps honoring historical figures who shaped the nation. One of those stamps featured Queen Amina of Zaria, sword in hand, leading her warriors. It was an acknowledgement, however late, that her achievements deserved to be remembered and celebrated. Today, statues of Amina stand in Zaria and Lagos. Schools and streets are named after her. She is featured in Nigerian textbooks as a symbol of pre-colonial African achievement and female empowerment. Scholars debate the details of her life, trying to separate historical fact from legend. But here is the remarkable thing. Whether every story about Amina is literally true almost does not matter. What matters is that she existed, that she ruled, that she conquered, and that 5 centuries later, people still know her name and draw inspiration from her example. In a just world, Queen Amina of Zaria would be as famous as Joan of Arc, as celebrated as Elizabeth I of England, as studied as Alexander the Great. She built an empire that rivaled European kingdoms in size. She developed military tactics that were innovative for her era. She ruled for decades with a combination of strategic brilliance and political skill that few leaders of any gender have matched. The fact that most people have never heard of her speaks to the systematic erasure of African history, to the biases that have shaped how we remember the past, to the assumptions about who deserves to be remembered and celebrated. But erasure is not the same as destruction. Amina's walls still stand. Her story still circulates. Her legacy still inspires. And now you know her story. You know about the warrior princess who became a queen, who built an empire, who proved that women could lead armies and rule kingdoms as effectively as any man in history. But there is still one more chapter to the story, one that connects Amina's 16th century world to our present day, a chapter about how her legend evolved, how historians rediscovered her, and why her story matters now more than ever. For centuries after her death, Amina's story lived primarily in oral tradition. The Hausa people of northern Nigeria preserved her memory through songs, proverbs, and stories, passed from generation to generation. She became a figure of folklore, not forgotten, but not quite historical either. Her achievements were remembered, but also embellished, mythologized, transformed into legend. In these traditional accounts, Amina grows larger than life. Some versions claim she was a giantess, physically dominating men through sheer size. Others suggest she possessed magical powers, that she could conjure victories through supernatural means. Still others focus on romantic and sexual exploits, claiming she took a new lover after every victory, only to execute them in the morning, a narrative that says more about male fears about powerful women than about historical reality. These legendary additions are common for figures who loom large in cultural memory but lack extensive written documentation. King Arthur accumulated similar legends in Britain. Charlemagne's historical achievements were embellished with fantastical elements. It is almost a mark of historical importance. Only figures who truly mattered get transformed into legends. But legends, however entertaining, can also hide history. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European colonialism dominated Africa and European historians began writing African history, Amina was often dismissed as purely mythical, a folk heroine with no historical basis. Like an African version of Wonder Woman, this dismissal was convenient for colonial narratives. If Africans had never built sophisticated kingdoms, never developed complex political systems, never produced military geniuses capable of building empires, then colonialism could be justified as bringing civilization to a backward continent. Acknowledging rulers like Amina women no less, who had built states that rivaled European kingdoms, complicated that narrative in uncomfortable ways. The systematic recovery of Amina's historical reality began in the mid-20th century, as African independence movements sparked renewed interest in pre-colonial African history. Scholars, many of them African, began the painstaking work of reconstructing the past from fragmentary sources. They turned to the Kano Chronicle, a historical document written in Arabic in the 19th century, but containing information passed down from much earlier periods. The chronicle mentions Amina, describing her as a military leader and listing some of her achievements. It provides dates, names of contemporaries, and details of campaigns. They collected and analyzed oral traditions, recognizing that while these might contain legendary elements, they also preserve genuine historical memories. By comparing different versions of stories and identifying consistent elements across accounts, scholars could begin to separate probable fact from later embellishment. They studied the Amina walls themselves, physical evidence that could not be dismissed as folklore. Archaeological analysis of these fortifications confirmed that they were built using techniques consistent with 16th century Hausa engineering. Their extent and sophistication indicated centralized authority capable of mobilizing enormous labor forces, exactly what you would expect from a powerful ruler. They examined trade records and accounts from North African merchants who traveled trans-Saharan routes. While few mention Amina specifically, she was, after all, ruling an inland kingdom that most North African traders never visited personally. They do describe a period when Zazzau rose to prominence in regional trade, when security along certain routes improved dramatically, when wealth flowed into the Hausa region in unprecedented amounts. All of this is consistent with Amina's reign, as described in Hausa sources. Slowly, painstakingly, a historical picture emerged. Not complete, there are still enormous gaps in our knowledge, but substantial enough that mainstream historians now acknowledge Amina as a genuine historical figure rather than a myth. The scholarly consensus today places her birth around 1533, her reign from about 1565 to her death around 1610, and her major campaigns in the 1570s and 1580s. Historians accept that she was a significant military leader who expanded Zazzau's territory, that she built extensive fortifications, and that she ruled for several decades. The more fantastical elements of her legend, the supernatural powers, the executed lovers, the claims of being 7 feet tall, are recognized as later additions. But here is what is fascinating. Even stripped of legendary embellishments, Amina's historical achievements remain extraordinary. She ruled for about 34 years, in an era when violent overthrow of rulers was common and where women rulers were extremely rare. That alone indicates exceptional political skill. She conducted military campaigns that expanded Zazzau's territory significantly and established it as a dominant regional power. This requires strategic brilliance, tactical expertise, and the ability to inspire loyalty in warriors who might otherwise have refused to follow a female leader. She put in place infrastructure projects, the walls, that required enormous organization, resources, and vision. These were not built overnight or on impulse. They represent systematic planning and execution over years or decades. She integrated Zazzau into trans-Saharan trade networks at the highest level, bringing unprecedented wealth to her kingdom and securing its economic future, and she did. All this while navigating the prejudices and constraints of a male-dominated society that had every reason to reject her authority, but ultimately accepted and even celebrated it. The historical Amina, the real woman behind the legend, may be even more impressive than the mythical figure, precisely because her achievements were human rather than supernatural. Today, Amina's legacy is being reclaimed and celebrated in new ways. Nigerian feminists point to her as proof that African women have always been capable of leadership and achievement. that male-dominated constraints are cultural choices rather than natural inevitabilities. Pan-Africanists celebrate her as an example of pre-colonial African achievement, evidence that African societies were sophisticated, powerful, and capable of producing world-class leaders long before European contact. Artists have reimagined her story. In 2017, a Nigerian animated series called Queen Amina of Zazzau introduced her to a new generation of African children. The series, while taking creative liberties, presents Amina as a role model, brave, intelligent, and principled. For young girls watching, many of whom have been taught that leadership and power are male domains, seeing a warrior queen who looks like them can be life-changing. Musicians have written songs about her. Nigerian artists across multiple genres, from traditional Hausa music to Afrobeat to hip-hop, have referenced Amina in their lyrics, using her as a symbol of strength, independence, and African pride. Scholars continue to research her life, hoping to uncover new sources that might fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Archaeological expeditions map the extent of the Amina walls, using modern surveying technology to understand their full scope. Historians comb through archives in North Africa and the Middle East, searching for any contemporary accounts that might mention Zazzau during her reign, but perhaps most significantly, Amina has entered the global conversation about historical women who have been overlooked or forgotten. She appears in books and documentaries about female warriors and rulers. She is taught in some world history courses as an example of pre-colonial African political systems. She's discussed in feminist spaces as proof that women's exclusion from power is not universal or inevitable. There is also growing recognition that the erasure of figures like Amina from mainstream historical consciousness is not accidental. It reflects centuries of bias in which European history was treated as world history, in which African achievements were systematically downplayed or ignored, and in which women's contributions were marginalized regardless of their actual impact. The rediscovery and celebration of Amina is part of a larger project of decolonizing history, of recognizing that human achievement, innovation, and greatness have emerged from all cultures, and that our understanding of the past has been distorted by the biases of those who wrote it down. Consider this. When we think of medieval empires, most people immediately imagine European kingdoms, or perhaps the Islamic caliphates. Few think of the sophisticated West African states, Mali, Songhai, the Hausa kingdoms that controlled vast territories, facilitated international trade, and developed complex political and cultural systems. When we think of great military leaders, names like Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, and Genghis Khan dominate. But how many people can name even one pre-colonial African military leader? Not because such leaders did not exist, they absolutely did, but because their stories have not been told with the same prominence. And when we think of women warriors and rulers throughout history, we might recall Joan of Arc, Boudicca, or perhaps Elizabeth I or Catherine the Great, but these are almost exclusively European figures. The assumption, often unstated, is that powerful women were rare oddities in history, and those who did emerge were products of uniquely progressive cultures. Amina challenges all of these assumptions. She proves that medieval Africa produced military geniuses equal to any in the world. She demonstrates that women in the 16th century could and did command armies, build empires, and rule with the same complexity as any male monarch. She shows that African history is world history, that it deserves the same serious study and celebration as European or Asian history. But here is what is truly remarkable. Despite centuries of neglect, despite the systematic bias against African history and women's history, Amina's story survived. It survived in oral traditions, when written records were lost or never created. It survived in the physical landscape through the walls she built. It survived in the cultural memory of the Hausa people who never forgot their warrior queen. And now, In the 21st century, as we are finally beginning to tell a more complete and honest version of human history, Amina's story is reaching a global audience. Children in Nigeria learn about her in school. Feminists worldwide cite her as an inspiration. Historians study her reign as a case study in female political authority and pre-colonial African state-building. There is a beautiful irony here. Amina fought to build an empire that would outlast her, to create institutions and structures that would survive her death. That empire, in its political and territorial sense, did not last. Within decades of her death, much of what she conquered had broken away. Within a century, Zazzau was just one Hausa state among several again, but her true legacy, her demonstration that women could rule, that African kingdoms could rival any in the world, that one determined, brilliant individual could reshape an entire region. That legacy has proven far more durable than any political empire. 5 centuries after her death, Amina of Zaria remains a warrior, still fighting, not with sword and cavalry anymore, but through her story, through her example, through the inspiration she provides to everyone who hears about her and realizes that history is larger, more diverse, and more magnificent than they were taught. Her walls may crumble eventually, worn away by weather and time, but the wall she broke down, the one that said women could not lead armies, could not rule kingdoms, could not build empires, that wall is still falling. And Amina helped start its destruction. You might be wondering, why does the story of a 16th century West African queen matter in the 21st century? We live in a radically different world, democratic rather than ruled by kings, globally connected rather than regionally isolated, where gender equality is at least theoretically recognized, even if not yet fully achieved. What can a medieval warrior queen possibly teach us today? The answer is everything. First, Amina's story matters because representation matters. For centuries, history as taught in schools and portrayed in popular media has been overwhelmingly centered on Europe and on men. This creates a distorted picture of human capability and achievement. It suggests, implicitly or explicitly, that certain groups, Europeans, men, Western cultures, are naturally superior because they are the ones who have accomplished great things throughout history. But this is demonstrably false. What is actually true is that certain groups have had more power to record their own histories and broadcast them to the world. African achievements were often dismissed as primitive or ignored entirely by European historians. Women's contributions were systematically erased or attributed to men. The history we inherited is not an objective record of what happened. It is a selective narrative shaped by power structures and biases. Amina's story disrupts this narrative. Here is an African woman in the 16th century, a period we are often taught was Europe's age of discovery and renaissance, who built an empire, commanded armies of 20,000 warriors, constructed fortifications across thousands of square miles, and ruled successfully for over 3 decades. She was not an exception who succeeded despite her background. She was a product of sophisticated West African political and military cultures that produced many capable leaders. For African people, particularly African women and girls, knowing that someone like Amina existed and achieved what she did provides a different lens through which to view themselves and their heritage. It counters the colonial narratives that suggested Africa had no history worth studying before Europeans arrived. It provides role models and inspiration from within African culture, rather than requiring African people to look exclusively to European or American figures. For non-African people, Amina's story should prompt uncomfortable questions. What else do we not know about African history? How many other figures, like Amina, have been forgotten or dismissed? What distortions exist in our understanding of the past because we have relied primarily on European sources and perspectives? Second, Amina's story illuminates the relationship between gender and power in ways that remain relevant today. Amina did not succeed by being one of the guys or by denying her gender. She succeeded by being exceptionally competent at every aspect of rulership: military strategy, political maneuvering, economic policy, diplomatic relations. She demanded to be judged by her abilities rather than her gender. And over time, she converted skeptics through demonstrated excellence. But she also faced obstacles specifically because she was a woman. She could not rely on traditional paths to power like male heirs. She faced pressure to marry that male rulers did not. She had to prove herself in ways that men in similar positions did not. And she had to maintain her authority while navigating a society that had deeply ingrained assumptions about gender roles. This mirrors challenges that women leaders face today. Study after study shows that women in leadership positions are held to higher standards than men, that their competence is questioned more readily, that their authority is challenged more frequently. Women have to be exceptional to be seen as merely equal to mediocre men. Amina's response: relentless competence, visible achievement, building institutional power rather than relying solely on personal authority, remains a relevant model. But her story also highlights the cost. She apparently never married, never had children, spent decades in military camps rather than enjoying royal luxury, and worked until she literally died on campaign. We can celebrate her achievements while also acknowledging that the barriers she faced should not have existed, and that her story does not mean women should have to make such sacrifices to be taken seriously as leaders. Third, Amina's story demonstrates the importance of infrastructure and institutions in building lasting power. Amina could have been content with military conquests alone, defeating enemies, extracting tribute, enjoying the spoils of victory. Many conquerors throughout history have taken this approach. But conquests without consolidation are temporary. Empires built purely on military might collapse when the conqueror dies or when military fortunes turn. Amina understood this. That is why she built the walls, not just as military defenses, but as permanent statements of Zazzau's control over territory. That is why she developed administrative systems to govern conquered territories. That is why she invested in trade infrastructure and diplomatic relationships, her approach building institutions and systems that outlast individual leaders is the foundation of any stable government or organization. It is the difference between movements that collapse when their charismatic founder departs and organizations that continue for generations. It is a lesson that applies to everything from nations to businesses to social movements. Fourth, Amina's story reveals the complexity of historical morality and the dangers of presentism. By modern standards, much of what Amina did would be considered morally problematic or even horrific. She conquered other kingdoms, suppressing their independence. She extracted tribute through threat of force. Her empire almost certainly participated in the slave trade, which was a standard practice across medieval Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Her military campaigns resulted in thousands of deaths. We should acknowledge these aspects of her reign honestly. Amina was a product of her time, operating according to the norms and values of 16th century West Africa. Conquest was how states expanded and secured resources. Slavery was a universal institution that would not seriously be challenged until the 18th and 19th centuries. Military force was the basis of political authority. To judge historical figures solely by contemporary moral standards is to fundamentally misunderstand history. It flattens complex human beings into simple heroes or villains. It prevents us from appreciating their achievements within their own context. And it often reflects a kind of temporal arrogance, the assumption that we, living in the 21st century, have finally figured out how to live morally. While all previous generations were morally backward, the more productive approach is to understand Amina within her historical context, recognizing both her remarkable achievements and the moral limitations of her era. while also thinking critically about how her story can inform our own time. We can admire her strategic brilliance without endorsing conquest. We can celebrate her breaking of gender barriers without ignoring the aspects of her rule that we now recognize as unjust. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Amina's story is a reminder that history is not a simple march of progress from primitive past to enlightened present. The 16th century Hausa kingdoms were not less developed than 16th century Europe in any meaningful sense. They had different technologies and different cultural practices, certainly, but they were comparably sophisticated in their political organization, military capabilities, economic systems, and cultural achievements. In some respects, urban planning, trade networks, religious tolerance, they may have been more advanced than many European kingdoms of the same era. The fact that Europe eventually colonized Africa had more to do with specific historical contingencies, Europe's development of ocean-going naval technology, the economic power derived from American colonization, the disease environment that favored Europeans in certain contexts than with any inherent European superiority. Amina's story exists in a version of the world where African kingdoms were powerful, sophisticated, and capable of producing leaders who could match anyone in the world. She ruled during a period when it was far from obvious that Europe would eventually dominate Africa. In her lifetime, the Ottoman Empire was arguably the world's most powerful state. The Songhai Empire in West Africa controlled territories larger than Western Europe. China, under the Ming dynasty, was wealthy and technologically advanced. European kingdoms were important regional powers, but they were not yet the dominant global force they would become in the 18th and 19th centuries. Understanding this, seeing Amina not as a curiosity from a primitive past, but as a leader operating in a sophisticated 16th century world that looked very different from what European-centered history has taught us, fundamentally changes how we understand global history and contemporary global relations. On a hilltop overlooking the modern city of Zaria, portions of an ancient wall still stand. The red earth has been worn by centuries of rain and wind. Trees grow through gaps in the fortification. Modern buildings have been constructed nearby, incorporating some sections of the wall into their foundations. But the wall endures. It is one of thousands of kilometers of fortifications that once protected Zazzau's territories. Most have eroded or been destroyed by urban development, but enough remain that you can still trace the extent of Amina's empire, still see the physical evidence of her vision and her determination. Local people call them the Amina Walls, and they are right to do so. These walls are her monument, more lasting than any statue, more meaningful than any written chronicle. Because here is the thing about Amina that makes her truly extraordinary. She was not supposed to succeed. As a woman in a male-dominated society, she was not supposed to lead armies. As a ruler in a region of competing kingdoms, she was not supposed to build an empire. As an African leader in an era when African achievements would be systematically erased from historical consciousness, her story was not supposed to survive. But she led armies anyway. She built an empire anyway. Her story survived anyway. Not because she was superhuman or magical or different from other women who faced similar constraints, but because she was brilliant, determined, politically astute, militarily gifted, and absolutely unwilling to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on her. She looked at a world that told her she could not do something and said, "Watch me." She led warriors who had been taught that women were weak into battle after battle, proving through victory after victory that competence and courage have nothing to do with gender. She built walls that would outlast empires, that would still be standing 5 centuries after her death, that would still bear her name long after the kingdom she fought against had faded into historical footnotes. She created a legend so powerful that it survived centuries of colonial bias, historical erasure, and systematic marginalization of African and women's history. And now, in the 21st century, Queen Amina of Zaria is finally receiving the recognition she deserves. Not as a mythical figure or a folk legend, but as a genuine historical person who achieved extraordinary things, who shaped the history of an entire region, and whose legacy continues to inspire people around the world. Her walls may eventually crumble to dust. The details of her campaigns may fade from memory. The exact dates and names may be lost to time. But the essential truth of her story, that a woman in 16th century West Africa built an empire, commanded armies, ruled for decades, and earned a place among history's greatest leaders, the truth is now part of the permanent record. It cannot be erased. It cannot be denied. It cannot be forgotten. Queen Amina of Zaria, warrior, conqueror, builder, leader, legend. She rode at the head of 20,000 warriors. She conquered territories that would become nations. She built walls that still stand after 500 years. And she proved once and for all that history belongs to everyone, not just to those who have had the power to write it down, but to everyone who has lived it, shaped it, and left their mark upon the world. Her story is African history. It is women's history, it is military history, it is political history. But most of all, it is human history, a reminder that human potential has no boundaries except those we artificially impose. That greatness can emerge from any culture and any gender. That the past is far richer, far more diverse, and far more inspiring than we have been taught to believe. The warrior princess became a queen. The queen became an empire builder. The empire builder became a legend. And the legend, 5 centuries later, is still teaching us lessons about courage, capability, and the power of refusing to accept the limits others try to impose on us. That is the legacy of Queen Amina of Zaria, and it will endure as long as her story continues to be told. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something you did not know before, I have a simple request. Share it. Tell someone about Queen Amina of Zaria. Post about her on social media. Recommend this video to friends who love history. Because stories like this, stories that have been marginalized and overlooked for too long, only survive when people actively work to keep them alive. Hit that like button if you believe history should include everyone's story, not just the ones we have traditionally been taught. Drop a comment telling me what aspect of Amina's story resonated with you most. Was it her military genius, her political skill, her defiance of gender norms, or something else entirely? And absolutely subscribe to this channel because we are on a mission to uncover and share the incredible historical stories that deserve to be as famous as any European king or ancient emperor. There are so many more stories like Amina's waiting to be told. African leaders, Asian conquerors, indigenous American civilizations, women warriors from every continent. History is vast and magnificent when you stop treating it as the exclusive domain of Europe and men. We are building a community of people who believe that history should be immersive, accurate, and inclusive. Join us by subscribing. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we drop the next deep dive into a historical figure or event that should be world famous, but is not. Together, we can make sure that stories like Queen Amina's reach the audiences they deserve. We can decolonize history, one story at a time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning what you have been taught, and keep believing that history is so much more than what made it into your school textbooks. This was the story of Queen Amina of Zaria, the warrior princess who built an empire and whose walls still stand 5 centuries later. Never forget her name.